Hi and welcome to this Grade Academy lecture. My name is Lisa Kilgarriff and what we're going to be having a look at today is the physical characteristics of soil. So when we think of the physical characteristics of soil, I always think of watts. So W for water, A for air, T for texture, temperature, and then S for structure. So we'll be looking at each of those components and how they have an influence on the soil, the growth that will kind of occur within soil generally, and why each of them are important. So the first thing that we're going to have a look at is the soil composition. So soil is made up of a number of factors. And this is the main soil composition, so you do need to know this. So soil is made up of 25% air, so you can see that over here, 25% water, 45% mineral matter, and the mineral matter is the parent rock that it has come from, and that will directly influence things such as the pH, their growth, how much sediment is in it, structure, loads of different things like that, which we will look at. And then the other thing is the organic matter, and the organic matter is your living organisms within the soil. And some soils will have lots of organic matter, meaning that they'll be more fertile. Other soil types will have less organic matter, meaning that they won't be as fertile. So the quantities may fluctuate with different weather conditions. And what I mean by that is that within the soil, everything always adds up to 100%. So if we have an awful lot of rain, the water amount might move up to 30%. And so if the water amount in the soil moves up to 30%, well then there's only a certain amount of room in the soil. So the air might move back to 20%. And you do kind of always want to keep them as the figures as they are here, because that's the, I suppose, the ideal structure of the soil. And when the soil has these different components in the right ratios, then obviously growth is going to be the best. But with weather conditions, soil water and soil air are going to be the main two that will fluctuate. The mineral matter is never really going to change because that's just there, to start with, and that's there underneath the rock. And the organic matter won't really be influenced by the weather conditions either. So it's really only the soil water and the soil air, but it is important to know and to understand that they will fluctuate. But generally, 25 air, 25 water, 5 organic matter, and 45 mineral matter, or your rock, is the main and the ideal soil composition. So the first thing that we're going to have a look at is soil texture. All right. So what does this actually mean? So the texture of anything is the feel of it. So if I feel a soil sample, whether it's either wet or dry, does it have rocks in it? Does it have lumps? Is it very kind of fine and grainy, or does it go into this crumb structure? When I add water to it, do clumps appear? So all of that is what you're asking yourself when you're looking at the soil texture. So the texture of a soil depends on the mixture of sand, silt, and clay particles, and they are the 3 particles that are present in soil. And we'll be looking at those anyways in a few minutes, but the different types of particles, and I suppose the majority of the particle, will determine the soil type that is present. It is a permanent property of the soil and cannot be changed. So if I have a sandy soil, that means that I have mainly sand in my soil, and I cannot change that. I can add certain fertilizers to help with the growth, but I can't change the texture of the soil. So to feel a sandy soil, it will feel kind of grainy. If I have a clay soil, on the other hand, that will feel very fine. Kind of, when clay soil is dry, it's very kind of powdery. And no matter how much I want to, I cannot change that. Again, you can just adapt it and you can add certain fertilizers, but you can't change the soil texture. So it is a permanent property. Soil texture is defined as the measure of the proportion of different size mineral particles in a soil sample. So it's the quantity of your sand, silt, and clay within your soil. A soil with equal proportions of each is called a loam soil. Now, that's really, really important. A loam soil has equal amounts of sand, silt, and clay. And because it has equal amounts of each, we would say that loam soil is quite fertile. So in the last video, we looked at our different types of soil, and we looked at the brown earth soil as being the best quality soil. And brown earth soil would be an example of a loam soil, because there's different, if we look at the particles that are present in it, there's different size particles and they're in equal amounts to one another. So soil texture affects different kind of components really in relation to growth. So it affects the water retention. So sand particles are quite large, so there will be larger pores, so therefore the water will move through. However, clay particles are quite small. They will stick together, and so it's harder for the water to move through. Aeration, again, the larger the particles and the larger the pore size in the soil, the more air that can move through. So if air can move through easily, we would say that there will be aerobic conditions. If air cannot move through, we would say there's a lack of oxygen, and we would call that anaerobic. The specific heat capacity of a soil will also be influenced by the soil texture. So certain soils will heat up faster. And soil fertility is also something that will be influenced by the soil texture. So clay soils naturally have a lot of humus present in them, so they would be quite fertile. But clay soils also can be known as cold soils, so they can be quite hard to heat up and hard for the heat to actually move around them. So here you have a diagram of the different soil particles, okay? So we have sand, silt, and clay. Now gravel is there, but gravel is much, much bigger. We don't really deal with that. It's really only sand, silt, and clay that we deal with. You can see sand, very big. So in a sandy soil, it's going to be grainy. The particles are going to be big, and the pores are going to be big. Silt, you can see it there as that small little dot. And clay, you can't even see it on this scale. So clay is very, very fine. So that's what I was saying. It's a very kind of powdery consistency. So looking at the characteristics of the different soil types. So I have done it here in a table. I think it's an easy way to learn it. And if you learn the different headings, you've got your sandy soil, which is mainly sand. You've got your clay soil, which is obviously mainly clay components and clay particles. And you also have your loam soil, which is equal amounts of each of them. So I'm going to look at each soil type because I think that's the easiest way to do it. Okay, and this table is in the notes as well, but I think there's a similar one in the book, but I think it's a very easy way to learn the different soil types. So sandy soil, they have good drainage. Why? Because there's large pores, and so therefore the water can move through easily. And when the water can move through easily, it's going to be able to move right throughout the soil. It's not going to get lodged in any particular area. When there's good drainage, there's generally good aeration in soil. So for sandy soil, they have large pores, so again, air is going to be able to move through easily. It heats up quite quickly because again, the water and the air can move through quickly, so that's going to help with the temperature. They're not as fertile, and the reason that they're not as fertile is because they don't have as much humus present, and humus is dead organic matter. They're easy to cultivate, so cultivation is working with machinery in relation to soil. And in relation to drought or waterlogging, they generally don't get waterlogged because the water can move through quite easily. Clay soils, again, the particles are very small, so they have poor drainage, poor aeration. They tend to heat up slowly because the temperature can't actually get through them. They are fertile because they do have high levels of humus present. They are more difficult to cultivate because if you have a lot of rain or anything like that, the rain is going to kind of be on the surface. It's not going to absorb down deep into the soil, and so in terms of using machinery, it can be a little bit more difficult to use machinery with clay soils. And they will retain moisture. So clay soils are kind of like a sponge, I suppose. Your loam soils then, again, what's a loam soil? A loam soil has equal amounts of sand, silt, and clay present. So they have good drainage because they will have larger pores and small pores. They'll have also good aeration. They'll heat up well because of the sand particles present in the larger pores. They are fertile. They're easy to cultivate because they have the different varieties of different particles in them, so they are easy to work with, and they retain water, but they are not prone to waterlogging. So they'll keep a certain amount of water, which is important for growth and for plant activity, but you don't want too much water to be kept. So it's really important that you can use the soil triangle. Now the soil triangle would generally be given in an exam question. And what you would do is you would be given different percentages of clay, silt, and sand present in a soil sample. And what you would have to do is you would have to use that information to find what type of soil it is. Okay, so what you're going to do now, it's hard to show it on the screen here, but just to go through it, you're given your different percentages of your sand, silt, and clay. So for your clay, you're going to go along whatever percentage is given. Okay, so we'll say there's 30 clay, 30 silt, and 40 sand. Okay, so my 30 clay, I'm going to get my ruler, so you'll need a ruler for this, and I'm going to place it here on the 30 and draw a line straight across. Okay, and again, do this in pencil, just in case you make a mistake. We'll come up to our silt, and our silt 30 is up here, and for the silt, you can see the way the arrow's going, it's kind of going down at a diagonal. So what we're going to do is we're going to get my ruler, place it here at the 30 mark, and draw a line down there, straight down there. And then we have sand, and that is, I said 40, so 40 again, it's here, and we're going to draw a diagonal line up the way. Okay, so we have a diagonal line coming down the way for silt, we have a diagonal line going up the way for sand, and a line going straight across for our soil, and then we are going to join it up, so line going straight up, yeah, straight up there first. And what you would find is that it's really in the kind of clay loam category. All right, so it is fairly straightforward to show it, but putting in your markings that's how you would use your soil triangle. Okay, and that would determine the type of soil that's present and the texture of the soil. So the next thing then is soil structure, and really when we're looking at soil structure, we're looking at the physical structure of the soil. So this is the arrangement of soil particles within the sample. So sand, silt, and clay are the main particles within the soil, and depending on which is the majority, that will depend on the type of pores that are present. And they may form clusters known as aggregates or PEDs. Now, aggregates are the main term that are used. Now, PEDs is kind of the older term. So when you have a cluster of sand, silt, and clay particles, we would call that an aggregate, or it's a little clump. An aggregate is a substance formed by combining many separate elements together. So you're combining, again, your sand, silt, and clay because they are the main particles in your soil. Okay, so how these particles come together will determine the pore space. Water and air are held in pore spaces, and a good soil sample should contain about 50% soil spaces to allow the air and the water to move through efficiently. So we also have different types of pores. So saying this just there, we have micropores, macropores. So micro anything means small. So micropores are tiny pores, and they are generally found in clay soils because the clay particles are quite small themselves. Macropores are larger pores. So anything macro is always larger, and macropores would be found in maybe sandy soils or loam soils where you have larger particles present. So what is porosity? So this is materials that contain tiny pores that allow gases and liquids to pass through easily. So they're tiny little pores, really water and your gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen are the main two that will move through. So soil structure is needed for different components. So the better the soil structure, it's going to have a more positive influence on growth and grazing and all of that, and really all the farm kind of industry and the enterprise. So it's really good for the drainage of excess water. So where you have quite large pores, so your macropores, water is going to seep down through the soil surface into those pores, and it can be transported quite easily. You don't really want to have too much surface water because that's going to lead to flooding. You can't really use that land, and it could also cause injury to your animals, which you don't want either. Plant growth is also really important. So where you have pores, both a combination of macro and micropores, you are going to have water and you're going to have gases for plant growth. And you're also going to have, to a degree, a certain amount of space for the roots of the plant to grow. And that's really important to allow them the space. And when they can have the space, then they can grow, and they can grow efficiently. Air movement in soil is another thing. And again, air movement, where we have a lot of air movement in the pores of soil, we are going to have heat being brought through. And that's going to be really, really positive. Root penetration, I've kind of talked about that. That's going to be really important for plant growth. So the more the roots can spread out and the more that they can penetrate, they can reach water and they can reach air, and then they can obviously can grow and develop. Okay. So just a few definitions here. So cementation, so to cement something together is to stick it together. So cementation are particles and cements are pushed close together. So cementation can occur where you have pressure from animals or machinery pushing down on the soil over kind of a long period of time. You're pushing the particles together. That is cementation. Separation is another one where you have the particles breaking up. So yes, you can have your animals cementing it and your machinery cementing the soil particles, but similarly, they are going to break them up, all right? Or you could have earthworms breaking up the soil when they kind of burrow through and form channels. And you also have flocculation. So what is flocculation? So flocculation is the gathering together of clay particles forming aggregates in the soil. And an aggregate is a clump of soil. A well-flocculated soil will have a crumb structure. Now we'll be looking at flocculation more in terms of the chemical aspects of soil. But if you have a clay soil and if there's a lot of flocculation, if there's a lot of aggregate formation occurring, what you will have is if you take up a soil sample, you will be able to break it up into breadcrumbs. And we call that the crumb structure, or the more scientific term for that is friable. It's a friable soil. And that's really, really good in terms of nutrients and in terms of fertility and everything like that. So factors affecting soil structure. So wetting and drying, that will cause the shrinkage of particles. So they're going to be wetting, they're going to be kind of expanding, then they're going to be shrinking. So very, very similar to the freeze-thaw action that we kind of looked at in a past video. Freezing and thawing, so again, swelling and shrinking of soil and rock will cause damage and will over time cause issues for the soil. Activity of the roots. So roots are really important to bind the soil together, but they'll also break up the soil because you don't want large clumps of the soil, because then obviously nutrients can't be accessed. But the small roots will break up a certain degree of the soil. The activity of earthworms and animals. So animals, I'm talking about your main kind of farm animals, so like sheep, cattle, but your smaller animals would be insects and earthworms. So they are going to break up the soil. Earthworms are really important in relation to soil and the structure of the soil, because what they will do is they will put channels through the soil. And when they put channels through the soil, water and air can move through those channels, and that will kind of influence the drainage and the growth of the soil. And then finally, we have tillage operations. So that will promote aggregation in the soil. So that will promote the kind of clumping together of your soil materials. So next thing is soil air. Okay, so there's 5 main components, I suppose. So soil air then is the next one. So what we have is, in the diagram here, what you can see is we have the movement of gases in and out of the soil, in and out of plants, and they need different gases. So plants need carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. Okay, they're going to produce a certain amount of oxygen, in that process. That's fine, but they also need, to a degree, oxygen, and they need oxygen in smaller amounts, but they do still nevertheless need oxygen for respiration. So it's really, really important that air and gas can move efficiently throughout the soil, because plants need them and they need them to grow. So soil air is the amount of air in the soil, and the ideal is about 25%. If soil air falls anywhere really below 10%, but between 8 and 10%, crops will fail because they don't have enough carbon dioxide, and they don't have enough oxygen. They're not going to be able to carry out the main two reactions that all plants carry out, which is photosynthesis and respiration. So that's, it's not going to be ideal for them. So what is diffusion? Diffusion is the movement of molecules from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So the movement of these gases from high to low, that is diffusion. So air in the soil is essential for the growth of roots, also for, once it gets into the plant, it's important for photosynthesis. Aerobic soil bacteria are needed. So aerobic means that oxygen is needed or oxygen is present. So when we have bacteria in the soil, and we'll be looking at those in a few videos' time, a lot of the bacteria and a lot of the microorganisms that we have in soil need oxygen. And so it's really important that the oxygen can actually get around the soil. And you also need air for earthworm activity. So they would be an aerobic organism. They need oxygen. So where you have very low levels of air, you're going to have very low levels of oxygen. You're not going to have many living organisms there. And so fertility in the soil is going to be decreased. The most important constituent of soil even is oxygen, and this is really important for respiration, which is the breakdown of nutrients and releasing the energy. So that's needed by both macro and micronutrients. Sand particles have large spaces between them, and they're generally quite well drained, as we've said already, and they're filled with air. Clay particles have smaller spaces. So when there's smaller spaces for water, there's obviously smaller spaces for air in the clay particles. So to make sure that soil has sufficient air, good drainage is needed. So whether that's going to be, drainage by artificial means, you do need to make sure that there's good drainage in your land, because drainage is important, yes, to move the water through, but it's also really, really important to move the air through. Soil water then is the next thing that we're going to have a look at, and this is the amount of water in the soil. So water is important for many reasons. So it's required by animals and plants for growth. So just the same as any living organism, water is needed for hydration, for growth. It's also really important for chemical reactions, because it is involved in the chemical reactions and the movement of electrons and the movement of particles, really important for that. And it's also an excellent solvent. So it's going to be really important to carry minerals throughout the soil. They might be minerals that are found naturally in the soil or added artificially, such as fertilizers. Large pores are needed for drainage, while smaller pores are needed to keep in a certain amount of air and water in the soil. So you need a mixture of really your macro and your micro pores. You don't want all very, very large pores. You want a mixture of both of them, because that's going to mean that air and water can get through easily, but at the same time, it's not all going to be lost and plants can use it. Sandy soils have large pores, which are associated with good drainage. However, clay soils are the opposite, and they generally have quite small pores, and they would be quite prone to waterlogging and to, in worst case or in poorer cases, flooding. So we have different types of water that are available to the soil. Okay, these definitions are important, so I would advise you to learn them. So the first one we have is hygroscopic water. Okay, so hygroscopic water, move over there, forms a thin film around the soil particle. Okay, so if this is my soil particle here, this is my water. So it's kind of like cling film around the soil particle. Okay, now to a degree that's useful, but also it'll cause problems because air can't get into that soil particle, nutrients can't get into it. It's just literally, if you have something and you've cling filmed around it, the cling film is quite tight. And that's the same with hygroscopic water. So it's where water will form a thin filament around the soil. The next type of water that we have is capillary water. Okay, so this is held in the pores within the soil and within the aggregates or the clumps. And to a degree, this can be used obviously for plant growth. Okay, so this would be available to the plants. Your hygroscopic water isn't, because it's very, very much attached to the soil structure. And then the final one is your gravitational water, and this is moved through the soil by gravity, and this is available to the plant. So your capillary water and your gravitational water would be available to the plant, again depending on the type of rainfall that has occurred. Your hygroscopic water isn't, because it's just formed that thin filament around the soil surface. So again, a few more definitions here which are important. So we have our field capacity. So this is the amount of water in a soil after the gravitational water has drained away, and so the soil cannot hold any more. So if we think of the soil as a sponge, if you soak a sponge in water, it can only absorb a certain amount of that water. And if you keep adding water to it, it's not going to be able to absorb it. So the soil is the same principle. It can absorb a certain amount of water and air, but when it reaches the maximum, it cannot absorb any more. Permanent wilting point. So to wilt means to kind of wither or to die or to disintegrate. So this is the point in which no more capillary water can be removed from the soil. Okay? So plants cannot absorb any more water. And the available water is found by taking one from the other. So this is the difference between the field capacity and the permanent wilting point, and this is the water that's actually available for the plant. Okay? So soil colour, so if we look at the diagram here before I put up the text, what we can see are different soil types. Okay? They've got different colours. So up here you've got like different layers, all kind of brown. Here, very dark layers. So you'd have an awful lot of organic matter here, like humus, very fertile. The next two kind of like have a reddy orangey colour. So there's probably some leaching there or build-up of iron. And down here, again, you have like a darker kind of colour. So again, maybe that's clay soil, the presence of humus. So different soil types will have different colours, all right? And depending on the colour, that will kind of affect things like the fertility. So the darker a soil sample, the more fertile it is. Why? Because there's high humus present in it, and I've talked about that already. What is humus? It's dead organic matter. Dark soils also absorb more sunlight, and they may heat up faster. Soils which are light brown in colour are generally have low humus content, so like your sandy soil, and they can be prone to leaching. Okay, so generally where you have light colour in the soil, there's a lot of leaching going on there, and there's low humus content. So for that type of soil, it's not going to be as fertile naturally, so you would have to supplement it with the correct fertilizer. That would be really, really important. The presence of a red colour or kind of an orangey colour in the soil will lead to high iron levels, and that's really, really quite evident if there's a lot of leaching occurring. So we had that already with our podzol soil, where we had in the B horizon a lot of kind of orangey reddy colour, and that means that there's a lot of iron present, and to a degree there was the iron pan present. And the final aspect in relation to the physical characteristics of soil is soil temperature. All right. So soil temperature is obviously how hot or how cold a soil is. Okay. So the rate of chemical reactions doubles with every 10 degrees rise in temperature. So the warmer the soil, the faster the growth rate. Okay. That is Van Hoff's law. So again, the chemical reactions doubles with every 10 degrees the temperature is of the soil. Okay, and when the chemical reactions, so the main two chemical reactions that would be involved in soil would be photosynthesis, respiration, germination. So the hotter the soil, the warmer the soil is, the better it's going to be. Now, for growth to occur, soil needs to be generally over about 7 degrees. Anything less than 7 degrees, you're not going to have a huge amount of growth. And that's why during the winter period, we don't see a huge amount of growth. The optimum temperature really for plant growth is anywhere between 20 and 30 degrees. So if you have your soil particles at those temperatures, you're going to have quite a lot of growth. So clay soils generally are seen as quite cold soils. So think of C for clay soils, C for cold soils. Sandy soils then generally will warm up a little bit faster. So the effects of temperature on different fractures, so it will affect germination. So the hotter the warmer the soil is, the better it's going to be in terms of germination. Water and mineral uptake. So water will move through and minerals will move through easier when the temperature is a little bit higher. When the temperature is quite low, it's quite hard for materials to move through the soil, and so therefore that's going to affect growth. And crop development and growth, because the warmer the soil, that's obviously going to influence the movement of minerals, and so therefore that's going to affect the movement of plants and the growth of plants, and so the warmer the soils, the better the plant is going to grow. Okay, so that is the physical aspects or the physical characteristics of soil. So again, think of watts, W for water, A for air, T for texture, T for temperature, and S for structure. Thanks for listening, and until the next time, happy learning.